Welcome back to Cinema Recaps. Today, I will introduce you to the 2016 psychological movie titled The Day Will Come. Spoiler alert ahead, proceed with caution. In 1967, brothers Eric and Elmer Johansson were sent to the God HOF Orphanage, where they met instructors Toft Lassen and Axel, who sent them to bed without a single welcome. It all began a few days prior when the brothers were caught stealing magazines and even a telescope, as Elmer was a space enthusiast who wanted to observe rocket launches. The Child Protection Office warned their mother, Oren, that simply talking to her kids would no longer suffice. The boys frequently skipped school and caused trouble, while Oren was busy working, unable to afford raising them, and had no time to care for them. If they heard any Or complaints about her struggling with the kids, they would take the boys away. Unfortunately, Oren suffered a breakdown and was hospitalized, where she was diagnosed with cancer. The brothers' uncle tried to gain custody of them, but lacking a permanent residence and having no income for 3 aunts, the Child Protection Agency decided to send the brothers to a prestigious orphanage. Back in the present, the brothers are experiencing their first Orning at Godhof. Everyone woke up at the same time and was led to the dining hall, where they couldn't sit to eat until given permission. Throughout the meal, everyone had to remain silent. Meanwhile, a new teacher, Lillian Hammershoge, was being shown around by Principal Forstander Frederick Heck, who informed her that while corporal punishment was outlawed, it was still practiced at Godhoven, and she could use it if she wanted, though it wasn't her style. Matsade then went to the dining hall, where all the boys greeted her in unison. Forstander Frederick approached the brothers, asked their names and future aspirations. When Elmer said he wanted to be an astronaut, he was slapped for being disrespectful. All the boys in the orphanage were required to work, and Forstander Frederick assigned the brothers the task of pulling rocks on the Lev E. Eric protested, explaining that Elmer had bowed legs and couldn't carry heavy loads, but he was slapped as well. Later, the brothers were given a break to eat lunch, but there was only one small tray of food that everyone fought over. The brothers managed to grab a few scraps, but at least they had a chance to talk to other boys and meet Toger and his friends. Toger advised them to stay quiet and act like ghosts. That way, they wouldn't draw attention or get punished. They just needed to wait until they turned 15, at which point they would receive a forever letter, a permit to leave the orphanage for good. Their conversation was interrupted by a group of bullies demanding cigarettes and food, then beating the brothers when they had nothing to give. Elmer was taken to the water tank but froze in fear halfway up, causing the bullies to amok and throw rocks at the future astronaut, afraid of heights. That night, the brothers tried to escape and nearly made it to the road, where a truck stopped for them, but they were ultimately returned to the orphanage. Everyone in town feared Godhaven, so no one dared to go against the principal's will. As punishment for running away, Forstander Frederick allowed all the boys in the orphanage to take turns slapping the brothers in the face. Lillian witnessed it, but could only help treat their injuries afterward. Later, as the brothers lay in bed, Eric convinced Elmer to start being a ghost from now on. Time passed, and the brothers struggled to adjust to daily life, but it wasn't easy. Elmer kept falling asleep in class, and his bowed legs hurt every day. When Eric found a chocolate bar in the trash and gave it to Elmer to ease his pain, Elmer decided to share it with Toger and his friends, earning their trust. They also noticed that at night, Axel would take a boy to his private room. One morning, Toft discovered that Elmer had wet the bed. As punishment, Elmer was forced to stand outside on a bucket, wearing only his underwear, and holding his wet blanket until it dried, leaving him shivering from the cold. Later, he was taken to the doctor and diagnosed as healthy, with only bowed legs and bladder issues. The doctor prescribed 2 pills for treatment. The boys started asking Elmer for more things because he was the P-boy, but other boys, grateful for Elmer's sharing, began giving him cigarettes to fend off the bullies. However, the bladder issue didn't improve even with an increased dose, and it made Elmer feel dizzy and sleepy. After he dozed off in class multiple times, Lillian checked Elmer's notebook and noticed he hadn't taken any notes. She also found another notebook of his, filled with private writings. She thought he had copied from a book, but when Elmer denied it, she made him read it aloud to the class. At that moment, she realized it was a journal where Elmer wrote about what was happening to him, but reimagined as a mythical story about becoming an astronaut. This turned out to be an opportunity for Elmer, as Lillian, who was in charge of sorting mail for the orphanage, recognized his talent. She assigned him the job of being the Mail boy, responsible for picking up the mailbag in town and bringing it back for sorting together. While the other boys read newspapers and listened to music, Elmer now had a task that kept his mind sharp and busy. He no longer wet the bed. One afternoon, as they sat together, Elmer learned that Lillian never had the chance to marry or have children. After a failed relationship, she decided to become a teacher for children. That same day, the brothers received a letter from their mother saying she was undergoing special treatment and being cared for by their uncle. When they asked Toger about his mail, he threw it at them, explaining that his father sent the same letter every year, with identical content, even sounding the same when read aloud by Elmer. They were just excuses for why his father couldn't visit during Christmas. What hurt Toger the most, however, was that his father never spared a moment to mention his little sister. Feeling sorry for Toger, Elmer made up a story about his family, saying that his sister missed him, even though Toger knew Elmer was lying, and that the letter didn't contain such words. Still, Toger thanked Elmer for the story because it gave him comfort. From then on, each boy handed their mail to Elmer to hear kinder words from their families, finding hope in his stories. One night, Axel chose Elmer as his next victim. Eric saw this and tried to take his place, but Axel slapped him and pushed him back into bed. When Elmer entered Axel's room, he was forced to obey his demands to spare Eric from suffering. Hours later, Eric found Elmer in the bathroom, washing blood trickling down his leg. Before Eric could say anything, Elmer collapsed onto the floor. The next day, Lillian attended a meeting with other teachers and was shocked by their reaction to the incident. They claimed an older boy had done it because it's a natural need during puberty. But since Elmer wouldn't name the culprit, they could only supervise the boys more closely. Lillian wanted to take Elmer to the hospital, but her request was denied, saying the orphanage doctor was sufficient. She tried talking to Elmer after class, but he was too scared to say anything, even though Eric told her it wasn't another boy who hurt Elmer. Days later, an inspector came to the orphanage for a routine checkup, but because they were informed in advance, the boys were dressed in their best clothes, and bruises were hidden under makeup. The boys had to say they were happy, or they would face punishment later. The inspector saw the boys working in the carpentry shop, supposedly learning a trade to prepare for their future, but in reality, they only worked that day as part of the show for the authorities. When Eric saw Axel lead Elmer into a small office in the shop to give him a gift in exchange for his silence, he noticed the saw and came up with an idea. After Elmer left, Axel returned to work and accidentally had his finger cut off by the saw. This happened because Eric had disabled the safety mechanism on the machine. Axel had to stay in the hospital for several weeks, during which the brothers were temporarily safe from his abuse. However, Forstander Frederick began to suspect Eric but had no evidence to act on. This drove him mad. That evening, during dinner, Eric received a call from his uncle, who informed him that Warren had passed away. Eric returned to the dining table, trembling and in tears. When Elmer heard the news, he couldn't contain his emotions either. Forstander Frederick, furious at the disorder, slapped both boys and shoved Eric's face into his plate. But even his anger couldn't stop the boys from crying, which only made him more frustrated, and he stormed off. Lillian seized the moment to comfort the two brothers. The next day, their uncle visited and shared that their mother had been freed from her suffering. However, he couldn't afford to take them in. After some persuasion, the three of them planned to escape at midnight and meet near the road. Before leaving, their uncle was convinced by Forstander Frederick that his lifestyle wasn't suitable for raising children, and staying at the orphanage would train the boys better for their future. Those words made him reconsider. That night, instead of picking up his nephews, he called Lillian to apologize and informed her he wouldn't come. Lillian tried to warn the brothers, but Forstander Frederick caught her in the act. Forced to confess, she had no choice but to reveal everything. Eric and Elmer were caught just as they were about to leave and were brutally beaten by Forstander Frederick. Forstander Frederick lied, claiming it was Lillian who had betrayed them. Furious, Eric attacked Lillian but was restrained by staff and taken to the basement. Lillian tried to apologize to Elmer, but he had lost all trust in her and said he was glad she didn't have children. Overcome with anger, Lillian slapped Elmer but immediately realized what she had done. She recognized that this place had changed her and decided to resign the next morning. At that moment, Axel returned, and from then on, Eric and Elmer seemed to become ghosts within the orphanage. In 1969, Gert Hartmann, a new inspector, made an unannounced visit to the orphanage to check on conditions before Forstander Frederick was to receive a knighthood medal for nearly 50 years of service. Forstander Frederick was displeased to see Inspector Gert Hartman arrive, as he hadn't had time to hide all the evidence. However, he couldn't turn the inspector away without tarnishing his report. Hartman quickly noticed irregularities. Too few bathrooms for the number of children, but what concerned him most were the bruises on their bodies. Yet all the children lied, claiming they had fallen or gotten hurt while playing, and none dared speak to Hartman privately when offered. The inspector was dissatisfied with the outcome, but left in silence due to lack of evidence. In a few weeks, Eric would turn 15 and become eligible to leave the orphanage. He planned to ask Forstander Frederick for permission to take Elmer with him. Forstander Frederick, thrilled about receiving the knighthood medal, even promised to let the children watch a live broadcast of Armstrong setting foot on the M-ON if they completed some tasks. Elmer was assigned to build a terrace, while Eric had to wash Forstander Frederick's car. While everyone was engrossed in the broadcast, Eric finished washing the car and earned Forstander Frederick's praise. Seizing the moment, he asked if he could take Elmer with him when he left the orphanage. But Forstander Frederick made a shocking announcement. He was opening a vocational training department at the orphanage, and now the children had to stay until they were 18. Eric, furious at realizing all his efforts to behave had been in vain, scratched the car in anger. When the broadcast ended, Elmer went looking for his brother, but only found bloodstains on the car. Forstander Frederick had beaten Eric nearly to death. 3 days passed, and Eric remained unconscious, with Elmer only allowed to see him from a distance. Nevertheless, he sneaked into the room when no adults were around, but was almost caught by Forstander Frederick and the doctor. Hiding under the bed, he overheard the doctor suggesting that Eric be taken to a hospital. And however, Forstander Frederick refused, saying that God would decide the boy's fate. Later, Elmer asked Forstander Frederick for a day off to visit the Post and Telegraph Museum, saying he wanted to become a postal worker instead of an astronaut. Forstander Frederick was pleased with this realistic ideal and rewarded Elmer with a coin to buy ice cream. In the city, Elmer used the coin to call Lillian after finding her number in a directory. Lillian, now a university lecturer, agreed to take Elmer to the child welfare office. They waited for Hartman for 6 hours, but didn't meet him, and another inspector could only file a report since Elmer didn't have any evidence. Returning to the orphanage, Elmer decided to take matters into his own hands. He met with Togger and his group, instructing them to wait outside, then snuck into Axel's room. Taking advantage of Axel's distraction, Elmer stole the keys and locked Axel inside. Afterward, Elmer visited Eric one last time to say goodbye, in case something happened. He crafted a makeshift astronaut suit out of cardboard and foil, then grabbed a hammer and went to the yard. Cheered on by his friends, Elmer began smashing Forstander Frederick's car as a declaration of war. When the supervisors discovered Elmer, Toff started beating him. Meanwhile, Forstander Frederick received a call from the inspector's office about the earlier report they had received. Realizing Elmer's plan, Forstander Frederick immediately stopped the punishment to avoid leaving bruises that could serve as evidence against him. Released, Elmer ran away and overcame his fear by climbing the tall water tower. From atop it, he jumped, pretending to be an astronaut floating in space. Inspector Hartman and Lillian arrived just in time to witness the scene. The moment Elmer hit the ground, Eric woke up from his coma. Both brothers were taken to the hospital, where Lillian cared for and watched over them. The doctors said it would take time to recover, but both would survive. Several days later, as their health improved, Lillian brought Elmer back to the orphanage. At the orphanage, Elmer demanded Forstander Frederick hand over the permanent records of him and Eric, while inspectors conducted a thorough investigation. With no other choice, Forstander Frederick reluctantly surrendered the documents without resistance. Before leaving, Elmer said goodbye to all his friends at the orphanage. Inspired by his courage this time, when Hartman asked if anyone wanted to share anything, Togger raised his hand first, and soon after, the other boys followed suit. As Lillian drove the two brothers away from the orphanage, they saw Tugger running after the car, waving goodbye as his only way to express gratitude for what Elmer had accomplished. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss exciting videos like this one. Thank you for watching.